Okay, sorry about the slight delay there. I will. I was working on new slides until the moment I came here. So you're getting the freshest of fresh lectures, just so fresh, so lectury. Where is my PowerPoint presentation? There it is. Okay, very fresh lecture. Oh no, it's happening again. No, thank God. Sometimes it weirdly happens that I can't page forward at all, but today everything is fine. Okay, so today we're going to keep talking about families, and you get to continue following me down my rabbit hole of talking about youth and marriage. Okay, so if you're just for the curious, this is now part 2. So basically what I did for part 2, and there's going to be a part 3 on Monday, inevitably. But for part 2, what I've done is I took a few of the slides from part 1 that we didn't get to last time, threw them in here, and then I'm going to keep going with a whole bunch of new material. Yes, that is what I'm doing. I have concluded my preamble. It's the Friday-iest Friday that ever did Friday. Still working on grading the exams, going well, looks good, but no results yet to discuss. Okay, and clearly for this particular slide, I went with incredibly bland graphic suggested by Microsoft PowerPoint, so don't worry, it gets better. Okay, it's also a different Slido because I could not get in the 30 seconds I had figure out how to jump this into the Slido I did for last class. So new Slido. Do we have readings on this course? Of course you do. I just forgot to post them again. I am slightly running a little bit of a marathon this week, but I will do that right after class. Hey Google. No. Hey Google. You always answer me. Why aren't you answering me now? Hey Google. Could you remind me in 1 hour to post the readings?
Got it. I'll remind you today at 2:05 p.m.
Awesome. It's funny. My friend also has a Google phone, so literally anytime he comes over, we have Googles all over our house, and I give it commands, and his phone starts talking to me. It's awesome. Okay, so we ended off on this slide on Wednesday discussing what Regnerus, right? So we're talking Mark Regnerus. Oops, that's a really ugly M. And his book. You can stop listening, Google. That's fine. Mark Regnerus' book. This is The Future of Christian Marriage. But again, we're not so much focused on the Christian aspect here as just his description of marriage and kind of what's happening. That's right. I crossed out the Christian part. That's what I did. So the book, is really the first part of the book, which I find really fascinating and which I'm kind of sharing with you. It's really a chronicling of what's happened to marriage, principally I think with the millennials. Oops, there should be another N there. And what we're going to see too with Gen Z, although maybe Gen Z will change things too. And the biggest change that Regnerus kind of thinks, again, just to kind of reiterate, is the change from marriage as sort of a foundational institution that most people entered into relatively young, and you built your life with another person, right? You combined your resources, halved your living expenses, and kind of built life together, right? So whatever, you typically started poor, right, and worked your way to rich together, right, as a unit for the most part. But what seems to have replaced it now is what he calls the capstone. And the capstone, right, is sort of the decoration at the top of your life. So you do the poor to rich thing by yourself. You do this alone. And once you have, gained your riches, right? You are now established, you have a career, you have all that jazz. Then you can think about getting married as the sort of like pinnacle or capstone or decoration on your adult life, right? So, I love these quotes. When people are building their lives, marriage is widely understood today as an achievement attained by each, not the beginning of constructing an adult life together. Okay. And again, I think this goes into kind of this lengthening period that we've been talking about. That's lengthening, it's an arrow that's getting longer. Period of kind of adolescence or emerging adulthood, right? Where when you think of marriage as a capstone, right, you're no longer really thinking about building an adult life, in the same way, right? You're moving, basically building things like career first, and then you go for some of those traditional markers of adulthood like marriage and childbearing. Okay. And most no longer think, I should have fixed that at 2 days. Think of marriage as a formative institution, but rather as the institution they enter once they are fully formed. And I think that's a really interesting insight, which is why I've repeated it. So, and it doesn't seem to matter, where you are, who you are, what you believe. This seems to be pretty broadly shared, certainly across the West and places that have been impacted by the West. And so we can say that, this capstone view of marriage is a sort of cultural export that has been broadly sent out, to places as disparate as, Lagos in Nigeria. Okay. So, again, a quote from the book, still from page 38. Page 38, I will say, is a very rich page of content. So, we now get ourselves ready for marriage rather than marry to get ourselves poised to accomplish common objectives, right? A home, job, family. Instead, marriage, I don't know why it says hose. Marriage now becomes one of those objectives. Have I said I work on these like feverishly and I don't double check them? And this is what an autocorrect from Grammarly for some reason put in there. I don't know why. Marriage now becomes one of those objectives. Okay, so marriage as a capstone to successful young adulthood is considered a safety mechanism, right? So, in a sense, how to put this? For both people involved, thinking of marriage as a capstone means that you know that other person is a good bet, right? That likely what's going to follow from that is, material wealth, probably fulfillment, and hopefully happiness. Okay, so what you get out of this is a very different, like historically very different kind of notion of what marriage is, right? So what Regner says, and this is again kind of a paraphrase statement, that it reinforces the independence of spouses rather than encouraging dependence, right? So in this kind of foundations model of marriage, you have two people that in a lot of ways are dependent on each other, right? They bring different things to the relationship, but they can't really function without each other economically, socially, or anything like that. In the capstone model, and I want to emphasize, I want to say, in describing this, I'm not attaching any kind of moralistic take to this, right? I'm more just interested in describing what's happened than being like the capstone is bad and the foundations model is good. Bless you. I'm not interested in kind of those moralistic kind of statements, but it's definitely a change, right? And I love this, which is why I bolded it. But now, even though it's bolded, I'm going to highlight it too. In capstone marriage, right, these are two adults that don't need each other. They want each other, right? So it's all about kind of desire rather than, an economic need. And again, this is very different. And this, in a lot of ways, can only come out of very materially successful societies, right? Because, when everyone was poor, I think men and women probably needed each other in different ways, But now that everyone's rich-ish by historical standards, I don't know, you probably don't feel rich, you know, you kind of shift to this idea of wanting each other instead. Okay, so this is probably, I think, this is the, okay, slow down. Speak good English. This is the aspect that I think has really struck me, and it has struck me both in this book by Rigneris a little bit less, but very much in Melissa Kearney's book, The Two-Parent Privilege. And again, the subtitle of that book, I know I've told you before, but I'm going to tell you again, is How Americans Stopped Getting Married and Started Falling Behind. So, marriage is changing from a populist institution, right? One that essentially in the past almost everyone participated in. With exceptions, right? There are always people that didn't marry for whatever reason, but it was a broadly shared social institution that almost everyone, you know, essentially participated in. I'll highlight this in a different color. Purple. I don't know why. Because luxury, right? Purple is a luxurious color. Going back to antiquity. Oh, that's a terrible highlight. That looks just the worst. Okay, we're gonna, no. Curse you, Rome, for making me think purple was great. Let's go with green. A luxury institution, right? So, who gets marriage, right? Primarily those who have made it economically, right? Because owning a home, a car, having savings becomes the way to cross this symbolic boundary that makes you marriageable, right? And to qualify for marriage. Even though, broadly speaking, most people still want to marry, only some people can actually afford to do so because of the increasingly high expectations that go into marriage. So, marriage, but not just living with someone, not cohabitation, requires economic and residential independence, which is about having enough money. So, basically, the rich and middle class can afford to get married. The poor can't. And so, and again, I think when we talk about Kearney's book, this theme is going to come up again. And again, I think Mark is a little bit more conservative than Melissa Kearney is, in the sense that, you know, he's a conservative Roman Catholic and, you know, someone who's written a lot of books that are widely hated by people in the academy. But Melissa Kearney is definitely not. And this is a statement I think she would agree with. You know, we're seeing growing inequality in the West. Okay, no question of that. This has been ongoing really since the 1980s, right? We've seen widening inequality. Whoops. I'm in a great mood. It's awesome. You don't have to tell me to cheer up. I'm happy. I'm just stoked to be teaching you all this weird stuff about marriage, like messing hopefully with your conception of reality. That's what I get off on Fridays, apparently. Okay, so growing inequality in the West, and again, we'll talk about this when we talk about Kearney's book. It's really interesting. Prompted, at least in part, by the marital divide between rich and poor. Let's change colors. Why? It's fun. The advantaged, right? So the rich consolidate their wealth and income by a marriage between two successful people. And what do the disadvantaged do? They're disadvantaged, so they get red. The disadvantaged are left without even the help of each other, right? So, and now we'll go back to yellow. The capstone vision has unwittingly turned marriage into an unaffordable luxury good. Despite that, right, and this is certainly something that Rigneris talks about a little bit, but Kearney's going to talk about a lot more, marriage has a lot of benefits, especially at relatively low socioeconomic levels, right? Amongst other things, right, it's really good for any children that come out of these unions. It has protective effects on, lowering the crime rates of children and parents, better life outcomes, educational outcomes, and all these things of the children, regardless of parental income, though parental income obviously helps. And so what does Mark Rigneris say about it? Blue. No, I already did blue. I have to pick a different color. Orange. It may sound outlandish, but it's not. Marriage, he says, is the social justice issue of our time. Excuse me. Sneeze, fighting. I've won. Okay. And again, I think this is something that when we dig into the data in Kearney's book, we'll see is something that has a pretty strong basis. That this changing vision of marriage has really made it difficult for the poor to succeed in lots of ways, and so they fall behind. Okay, what about marriage? Can poor people not afford? Is it like the actual wedding? Yes, it is. That's part of it. Or is it more they can't afford to share what they have with a partner? Okay, so I'm going to talk about this, but let me partially answer this. There's a changing vision of what marriage means, right? And it's this, right? So if I go back here, you come into marriage, you have to have these things, right? To be worth marrying, right? No, you're like, yeah, no, I don't want to marry some jerk with no car, no house.
I have a car and a job.
A car and a job at the minimum, right? Look, I'm not saying go marry someone who is totally unmarriageable, but, right, it's not just a kind of bare level of material success. It's actually an increasingly high bar. The kind of lifestyle that is expected out of, someone that you would marry is relatively high. So it's not, and Mark Rigneris actually says this a whole bunch of times in the book. He's like, getting married is actually relatively cheap, right? If you want to get married, you can go down to the courthouse, like, because he's American, right? Or you could book a justice of the peace. I think the justice of the peace costs like $40 in the book, where it's like, you must invite your parents and your parents' friends and everyone your parents have ever met, and the entire village and the village next door, and your high school gym teacher. So the actual weddings can be quite expensive, but you could do marriage quite cheaply. But because people expect, a lot within it, only some people can afford it in the sense of even being considered marriageable. And we'll talk about that as we go. I have made an absolute disgusting mess of this slide, and I love it. Okay. So, let's go on. We'll see if we married that, or if we answered that. Fuck, Friday. Okay. I actually, like, in my next class, which I don't have today, I have on Monday, Wednesdays, my English got so battered at one point that I just broke into Russian for like 45 seconds, just like clear my head. And I'm like, okay, now that I've, sworn at myself in Russian, let's go back. Okay, we're gonna switch back to my pen if my fat fingers will allow. Okay, so is there an ideal age to marry according to Rigneris? Well, he says, amongst other things, that this is often a question that people who study marriage sociologically get asked, and he said it's kind of a misunderstanding of what sociology does, right? We deal very much in averages, right? So we can say that on average, things like this. American men 18 to 20 who get married, almost half get divorced within 5 years, because they're not emotionally mature. They're probably picking a potential partner based on, shall we say, questionable criteria, like, she pretty. I have a really good friend of mine, and he picked what I will suggest was a very bad partner. He's now divorced, and she's taking him absolutely to the cleaners. I was like, "Are you sure? Are you sure?" He's like, "Well, yeah." I'm like, "But why?" He's like, she's really pretty. And I'm like, that's a terrible criteria. I may not have been his exact words, but that was my interpretation of it. There may have been some other ones that are not PG, so we'll skip those. Okay, so yeah, they're less likely to understand things like, how to sacrifice, communicate, and solve problems. And this tends to get better as they get older, right? For men and for women. This tends to get older. I've heard some sociologists suggest that about 24 is probably kind of ideal, because, younger than that, you're too immature. And older than that, you're too rigid. So, it's hard to kind of accommodate yourself to living with someone else. My sister tried moving in with someone, and I think she was 40, and that lasted about 3 months because they were both so rigid at that point that they just got on each other's nerves constantly. That may not be a universal experience. I will suggest that my sister is not the easiest person to get along with. But aside from that, all good. Okay, so, right, big themes in Regnerus's research about marriage. Okay, so what do you need before you get married? Okay, so you need time to launch a career or at least acquire financial assets, right? So money. When it comes to thinking about like the timing of marriage, the almighty dollar plays a huge role, right? Or the almighty ruble or lira or whatever. Time to mature is important, right? People will say, oh, you have to be mature, but not too much time, right? Because you don't want to end up here and too rigid to kind of make things work. And of course, the reality of female fertility plays a role as well, right? You don't want to wait so long that having children, if you so desire, would ultimately be too difficult, right? So, most women tend to want to get married in their 20s and have their first child, before they turn 30, but that isn't always the case, right? So kind of late 20s is where most people put it. But, sociologically, your success rate's pretty good at around 24 and gets worse the further you go in either direction. Okay. So, this is, I don't know, if you might not find this interesting. I found this tremendously interesting. And I had to go look at the calculations that he did and all the code and all the kind of regressions that were built into this. Regnerus took a bunch of marriage data from all across the European Union. And what he wanted to kind of try and figure out was, does the kind of increasing age of people at first marriage correspond to a decline in the total number of marriages generally? Because some demographers and sociologists, and some pretty prominent ones, have suggested that, it's not actually it's unlikely that this is going to decrease the number of marriages total. It's just a tempo effect, right? People's lives move slower. And think of Twenge and her idea of the slow life plan, right? It's the slow life plan. We grow up slower because we have to invest more in ourselves because there's competition for scarce resources. So we are going to see, marriage catch up. It's just a tempo effect, right? The tempo of our lives is a lot slower than it was for previous generations. Now, according to Regnerus, the delay actually matters quite a bit. So what you get, for every 1 year increase in the average age of first marriage in Europe, the rates of Europeans between ages 25 and 44 having ever been married decreases by 3.44%. Okay, that doesn't sound like a lot, except of course that it's a compounding effect, right? So that, every time you add a year, you add a further kind of percentage increase. So there's a lot of variation in kind of how much the age at first marriage has changed across Europe. Switzerland is kind of the low. It's changed by about 2.6 years in the last 20. right? So that's a relatively small amount. And the Czech Republic, has changed at basically 6.3 years. The age at first marriage has increased. Okay, so this means roughly a 22% decline of people in the Czech Republic who will ever get married, right? So he calls it a quantum, right? It's a huge increase. And as that age at first marriage increases, the number of people getting married is going to decrease, right? The people never married is going to increase tremendously. So, if you think of the numbers we saw at the beginning of the course, right? Average age at first marriage in 1950 was about 22. For the US, right, it's about 28, 29 now. So that has increased, roughly the same, about 6%, so pretty close to the Czech Republic. So you can kind of guess that the, increase in the number of people having never been married is going to jump considerably. Okay. In South America, right, slightly different than Europe. Every year of increase in the average age of first marriage is associated with a 5.24% decrease in the ever married rate for those 25 to 44. So that is an even bigger effect than what you see in Europe, right? A full almost 2 percentage points greater. So South America's age at first marriage isn't European levels yet, but it is getting there. And so you can see that, the number of people ever married is going to decrease. Now, from a policy perspective, if you're interested in public policy, right, and maybe you are being a sociologist, there is the possibility that this can lead to a low fertility trap. So what does that mean? Oh, now I have to explain TFR and fertility rates and kind of how this works. Okay, so let's put it this way. I should have had a whole other slide to explain TFR, but I'll explain it to you really hard and fast. It's Friday. Okay, so TFR. Do you know what TFR is? Total fertility rate. Okay, do you know what it means? Do you know how it's measured?
Compared to death?
Nope. No. Okay. So total fertility rate is measured basically number of children per woman in the fertile range, 15 to 44 years old, right? So that's roughly the range at which you can bear healthy children. And obviously, the further you get, the harder it is to conceive. So usually this is expressed in kind of numerical form, right? And the kind of magic number is 2.1 children per woman in the fertile range. That keeps your population steady, right? If you're in a modern society with low infant mortality, right? If you end up in a society with high mortality, totally different story. You need to have a lot more babies. But in a low death society, 2.1 children per woman in the fertile range is replacement fertility. Now, what tends to happen as the age of first marriage goes up? The total fertility rate goes down. Okay? So age at first marriage goes up, TFR goes down. Why? Well, just basic math. The younger you are on this scale, the easier it is to get pregnant and have a baby, right? It's unfortunately true, but teenagers can get pregnant a lot more easily than 44-year-old women. If it was the other way around, that would probably be better, but what are you going to do? Talk to the boss if you don't like it. So, what the hell am I saying? So basically what's happened, as the age, and most people try to wait until they get married to have a child. So as the age of first marriage has gone up, people have less time. This is a clock. It's a really good one. People have less time in that fertile window to have children. So naturally, the number of children you have tends to go down. Now, for one generation, this won't tend to be a problem. However, if this effect compounds over time, in order to kind of keep a population from declining, let me back up one step. If this keeps up for a while, you have fewer women in the fertile range, right? Fewer women, that's a terrible woman sign, but you got what I'm saying, in the range, right? Which is going to mean that in low fertility societies, either your population is going to decline, which is what we're seeing in a lot of places, or in order to kind of grow your population, women are going to have more children, right? Like considerably more children than on average. So you can get caught in a low fertility trap, and you can argue that, society, go away, Twinkie. You can argue that, we already see societies where we are seeing a low fertility trap, right? Japan, South Korea, Russia, Ukraine, really severely in Ukraine. And you could list a few others, but let's leave it there. Where, in order for them to get back on track in terms of population growth, or at least sustaining population, you're going to have to go to somewhere between like 3.1 to 4.2 children per woman on average, which there are only, and I'll talk about these later because there's a fun little fact here. There's only 2 countries in the Northern Hemisphere that have fertility rates that even approach this. And they're probably countries you would never think of because they're not that important. One of them is Georgia. So the country, the little Caucasus country just south of Russia, and the other one is Mongolia. So apparently one day we'll all be speaking Mongolian again. Might take a while, but Mongolia has a pretty high fertility rate. You could add, if you want to add like Westernish countries, Israel. Because Israel has a pretty high fertility rate as well. I'm going to put them over here because there's no space to write there. Okay, so that's a low fertility trap, right? And this is something that increasingly, demographers and Elon Musk are worried about. Elon Musk is really on about this fertility thing, low fertility being a problem. But a lot of Western societies, without any immigration, would already find themselves in a low fertility trap. You simply don't have enough women to kind of get the birth rate up, right? Or get enough children born without women having a lot of children. And most modern women simply don't want to have 3 or 4 or 5 children for obvious economic reasons. Okay. I sometimes think I should just leave big white spaces on my slides so I can doodle on, but I don't want to. Okay. So to answer this question, now there's many more questions. Apparently this is my best unit ever because this is where I go through whole units, no one has a single question. Okay, I'm gonna go back. But this top question, right? This kind of answers this. Okay. Both men and women, although women slightly more than men, expect men to bring more resources into marriage, right? A lot more. And those who can't sustain a lifestyle are not considered marriageable. So women have a very particular, according to Regnerus, idea of the kind of lifestyle that they want to lead. And it's a very affluent one. And it starts from day one. This is not, I'd like to get there eventually. This is from day one of our married life. This is the kind of lifestyle that I expect to have, right? And it's not necessarily stated as explicitly as that. It's one of those things that's just kind of floating in the ether. People know what kind of lifestyle they want, and they're not going to entertain any partner that can't provide them with that lifestyle or help them maintain the lifestyle they already had. Yeah, higher lifestyle demands are being imposed on both men and women, right? And here Regnerus sort of blames globalization, the media, I blame the Kardashians because it's all their fault, like everything else. The media, movies, television, whatever it happens to be. But to be considered for marriage, men need to be able to sustain their partner's lifestyle, right? And this goes like if that partner then gets pregnant and has to leave work, that lifestyle has to be maintainable. Okay. And here, you'll see part of this quote again later, but I wanted to throw it in here. In the capstone standard, being poor is a sign that there's something wrong with you and you're not yet marriage material. Not that one day you might make it, right? But that you're actually just not marriage material. There's something wrong with you. So, and here's the answer to that question, which is why I'll use a different color. Red. Rigneris argues, and I think Melissa Kearney would agree, that this has been devastating for the poor and working class, right? Because it turns marriage into a luxury institution. You can't enter it and get the benefits of marriage, of those kind of shared living arrangements, emotional, psychological benefits, support of children. You don't get those in the same way if you can't afford to get married. And a lot of poor people simply will never cross that boundary, right? So they will never get married. Okay, so there's really high material and psychological expectations that accompany marriage. And it becomes like one more institution. And here I'm gonna throw out a totally different concept that Rigneris doesn't talk about, but totally came to me. And if you took my religion class, you probably remember, or maybe not. This is a guy from the 1960s called Philip Reef. And he wrote a book called The Triumph of the Therapeutic. I am never, the rest of this course is just going to be this unit on marriage. I'm just moving so slowly through it. But I'm really interested in it at the moment. So, The Triumph of the Therapeutic, basically, Philip Reef suggested that every aspect of modern life is shifting towards a sort of therapeutic model where it's all about self-fulfillment, right? So it's all about this kind of psychological fulfillment that has to come out of everything. And he talks about this in lots of cases, but I think in a sense, what we're seeing in this kind of capstone capstone model of marriage is the triumph of the therapeutic, right? It's another institution that is meant to be completely personally fulfilling, and if it's not, you don't start. And again, contrasted to the foundation model, where you would reach goal, you would consider marriage as a way to reach your goals of financial stability. The capstone marriage says you have to achieve it on your own before you can get married. And what Rigneris suggests, and I think what Melissa Kearney suggests as well, is that this is way harder, right? Achieving this high standard on your own is way harder than achieving it with someone else, right? Where you can support each other, you can work with each other, you can, maybe they go to work while you do more education, right? Where you're investing in each other. All of these things get harder if you're expected, before you can enter that kind of relationship, to have all that stuff lined up. Okay. Also, goofy on the beach proposals. So, some challenges, and we got, 9 minutes? I'm really fired up about this topic. I don't know why, I just really find it interesting. Okay, so between 1996 and 2016, in the US, men aged 25 to 34, basically, and started with white men, but then it's kind of trickled through to all racial groups, have struggled mightily in the labor force. And what's happened to them is their labor force non-participation rate, so the number of them that were unemployed or not seeking work, surged from 6.7, so this is a 2-decade kind of process, and roughly, slightly less than doubled to 11.3%. So, a lot of men basically became sort of, okay, you probably heard, these are like our incels, right? The involuntary celibates probably come out of this group, but they essentially became economic non-actors, right? They basically exited the labor market and the workforce entirely in such a way that they're, essentially completely unmarriageable and completely, not worth having a relationship with. Okay. So, the other thing that's been suggested, and this idea actually comes from Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren when she was a professor at Harvard University. So pretty liberal kind of lawyer and economist, that what we've sort of created socially is what she calls a two-income trap. That in order to sustain kind of the modern lifestyle, essentially both adults as a part of any arrangement need to work. Okay, and I want to stress the need to work, so why don't I highlight it? Not that they both choose to work, that's fine, but they need to work. Now, she was looking at this principally in Boston, Massachusetts, right? Where Boston, had gone through a massive surge in real estate prices. And she said that this, in a lot of cases, was actually driven by, partially by two incomes, right? That basically what happened is people with two incomes end up in the housing market, and they want to buy a house. Now, because they have more income, they'll pay a higher price, right? So because you have more money, you'll end up paying a higher price because you can, at least in theory, afford it. So what happened in Boston, and this is a story that you'll probably recognize, is that in the 2000s, you had a sort of real estate surge, and you had bidding wars, where people would look at properties. That's bidding wars, that's an R. Bidding wars, right? Where people would bid like $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 above asking price on properties. And what Warren suggested was a lot of this was driven by people having more income, but what ended up happening then is having two incomes, because housing costs went up so much, went from being a choice to a requirement, right? Because, okay, now you have a house that you paid way too much for, and your mortgage is way too high. So to keep that house, you're gonna need those two incomes, right? So now you're trapped in a two-income trap. So things like having children and, one parent staying home to raise the kids became impossible. So you have kids and you send them to daycare. But daycare costs a shit ton of money, trust me. I mean, I guess it's getting better. I think we're dropping down to $15 a day, except now poor people no longer get a subsidy, so they have to pay the full rate. It's awesome. No problems with policy there. It's expensive. Okay, well now one parent is working basically just to pay the childcare for children, right? And in places like Toronto, like at the peak before the $15 a day childcare came in, sometimes you were talking in downtown Toronto, the cost of childcare was $2,200 a month for an infant, which is absolutely bonkers, right? But that was the market rate. So find you a place, let's say, you're working at a decent white collar job, that's like half your salary. Have two kids, well, then your whole salary's gone. But you can't afford not to work because, you also need to pay the mortgage and food and all that stuff. So you end up in what's called a two-income trap, right? So this is one of the challenges, right? Increasingly, our economy is set up around a sort of two-income trap for families, right? So there's a lot of disincentive to actually marry and start a family because once you have kids, right? Once you have to buy into the housing market, you're going to need those two incomes. You're going to need to sustain a really high lifestyle, which means both people are going to have to work. So it ends up being a bit of a psychological problem. Okay. Now, that said, you would think that the higher cost would lead to, more marriages, right? Potentially. Like if everything's expensive, right? Combining housing and incomes is probably better than living on your own. So younger people would probably want to get together with someone, maybe get married, at least to save in costs. Plus, I can tell you the bulk of the sociological evidence tells us that marriage is kind of good for people, right? It's good for your health. It's good psychologically. It has all sorts of benefits. And what Rigneris talks about, what we'll talk about next time, is that at some level, it seems that men, still, I tried to find, by the way, pictures of a woman proposing marriage to a man, and I searched for it, and all it gave me was men proposing to women, right? Which tells you something. Google image search isn't perfect, but it does suggest that this scenario remains the cultural norm, right? Okay. No political statements. Okay. Don't poor people see other poor people as marriageable? They do not, and that's the problem, right? That's the problem that both Kearney and Rigneris are flagging. They don't see each other as marriageable because they don't have the income to sustain whatever kind of lifestyle people think is the norm. Okay, what about factors like religion that play into marriage divorce rates of younger people? Okay, that one would take longer to answer. Okay, this is a joke about Elon Musk, which I'm all in for, but we don't have time. Is the reason for low total fertility rate just age, or is it that people don't want to have kids anymore? Yes. To both of those propositions. That is it. Yes. Both and, not either or. Okay. To clarify, low fertility trap is when the age of first marriage goes up, the fertility rate goes down, and then a few generations on, there aren't enough women to actually keep your population sustained, right? Because your generational cohorts will get smaller and smaller, and eventually you'll end up with Gen Z, which is a really small cohort, and there just aren't enough people to make babies, right? So if you want to sustain your population, then your TFR has to go way up, which means women have to have a lot more babies, or at least some women have to have a lot of babies. Evidence suggests that this is not a problem that's going to last any considerable amount of time. Global population should halve by about 2150, roughly speaking. Certainly by 2200, there will be less people on Earth than there were at the end of the Second World War, if nothing changes, which it always does. So there might be no people, just nuclear war, or Elon Musk will move us all to Mars. Who knows? Okay. Hang on. Not marriageable. Is our society cooked? I make no predictions. I'm just describing phenomena. Sweet! I must see this. I will look after class. It was hard to find in my 30 seconds of searching. Okay. Okay. Why don't I leave it there? We are out of time. We are out of time. I'm so out of time. I'll talk about the Mormons next time. Mormons, on the whole, don't get divorced, but that's a different story. They will remain unhappily married forever. Oh, well, that was fun. You're all doomed. I will die long before any of this becomes a problem.
Exactly.
What's that?
I hopefully will too.
If I keep teaching 5 courses a semester, I will clearly die long before that. Like next week, possibly. Yes.
Like we started the class, like as in the families part, by saying that like most people don't even believe that marriage is like an institution that would like not believe in, but like promote. Like let's just
So
say
about
that.
Americans about 2/3